You have 4% of Americans on GLP-1 drugs. That's a lot of people on these drugs. I went on this drug, and the great thing about these drugs is they can condition you while you're on them to eat differently. I used to run this little agency. It's called the Food and Drug Administration.
Dr. David Kessler is a former FDA Commissioner and pediatrician whose groundbreaking policies transformed public health.
Whose latest work explores the biology of addiction, food, and chronic disease.
These drugs can become so readily available now on the internet. The risk versus benefits isn't always obvious for some people.
They are very powerful. They are potentially very dangerous.
The worry I have is the microdosing side of Ozempic, where a lot of people now are trying to teeter with the dosages to get those last few pounds off.
Now you're telling me people are making up
Microdosing
of a powerful drug. People will lose weight. They go off the drugs. They only make you push to the edge of nausea while you're on the drug. What's going to happen when you go off this?
You're going to gain weight.
The average amount of time in the U.S., the data show that people are on this drug are 8 to 9 months. About 20% go off and go back on.
I think that's a big thing, right? It's essentially causing that problem. There's not any type of nutritional therapy around these prescriptions of drugs.
The question is, can we crack this thing called food addiction? That wanting, that cue-induced wanting, and that craving only comes on when I try to resist. You don't know these circuits are at play until you say you go without, because you can't get rid of the circuits. The circuits are there, but how do you tame the circuits?
Firstly, I want to say thank you to tuning in and listening to the show. It means a huge amount. And connecting with all of you is something that I absolutely love as part of this journey of growing the show. One of my biggest goals of 2025 is doubling the reach of this show. And I can't do that without your support. So I would love to ask you a favor. If you can press subscribe or follow on whichever platform you listen to. This helps us reach more people. And for me, elevating women in science is so fundamental and ethical and scientific information. So if you feel the show empowers you and gives you the information that you've been seeking, I would love to ask a favor in return and to hit that subscribe button and help me reach the goal that I've set for the show of 2025. Thank you. David, welcome to Live Well, Be Well. First of all, congratulations on an incredible book that I've been reading for the past 3 days, prepping for this interview, on a very prominent topic, probably one of the most prominent topics politically at the moment, food and weight, and the food industry and the environment that we are in our modern health. And some might call it a crisis. And when I was thinking about how to start today's conversation, I was thinking that 3 out of 4 of us will die from a chronic disease. Heart disease, stroke, type 2 diabetes. And at the core of that is metabolic issues and weight. And you have delved heavily into weight loss and weight management in this book. And so I think one of the biggest questions that surrounds weight for many people that will be listening to this is, why is it so hard to lose weight and keep it off?
The great mystery. And I've done it repeatedly through my lifetime. I would gain weight. I'd lose it. I thought I was done. I went on with life. I have suits in every size. And I would always gain it back. And that was the central mystery. That's always been the hard question when it comes to obesity and basic physiology. I think the answer to that is in significant part, because there are a lot of things at play, is that there are neural circuits, there are reward circuits that are there, that if you're dealing with an addictive substance, a highly processed, highly palatable, energy dense, high glycemic foods, they're very powerful, they're very salient, they can capture attention. I think they trigger the reward centers of the brain. And I think you're defining, in essence, that regain is nothing more than relapse. Why is it so many people don't want to, gain it back, but they do things that they don't want to be doing. And there are neural circuits that are in an environment where I will continually get cued and trigger those circuits. I think that those circuits are probably the reason why, those addictive circuits. Now, there's metabolic adaptation. There are other changes that occur on the energy expenditure side. But, the reason why appetite, if you lose weight, that appetite resumes. It's almost as if you had this life preserver and you push this life, when you have this life preserver, you try to push it underwater, and you have these opposing forces, and there's only so long you can, push these. I think in the current environment, move me to Mars, it's a different, I'm not going to get cued. I'm not going to trigger those circuits. But I think you have, in an obesogenic environment, we are vulnerable because those circuits, for many of us, right, were, through evolution, were, evolved to have us focus on the most salient stimuli environment from a survival perspective. In an environment of scarcity, there were advantages to be able to know where that energy-dense food was and to pay attention to it. Our brains were, evolved to be able to focus on, if in a scarce environment where that food was, where that energy density would attract our attention. Switch the environment to one of abundance. It's not that our brains are not working or something's wrong with our brains. Our brains are working only too well. We're just triggering them constantly. So I think the big thing that these new anti-obesity drugs, I think we can all agree, do is they work on biology. We can discuss what they actually work on. But, they show that it's biology and not willpower that is driving this current crisis.
There's so many things that I want to touch on there. And one thing that is really interesting is that you say that obesity is not just a disease of the body, but of the brain. And when I heard you talking about, obviously, our modern food environment and it being a very obesogenic food environment with lots of ultra-processed foods, which I know you use a different word for, which I also want to go into. Why is it, though, that some people don't find it hard to struggle in those environments or can actually eat whatever they want and never put weight on? And other people can sometimes say, well, I look at food and I put weight on. What's going on there?
I think we're dealing with the reward centers of the brain. Those reward centers of the brain focus on whatever the most salient stimuli based on past history and past learning for the individual. To me, it's less interesting, why everybody has gained weight. And again, the issue is not weight. The issue is visceral adiposity. It's health. The people I'm most interested in understanding is why, for that 15% of the population for whom, food is not a salient stimuli, why not? We all have these reward circuits. And I'm pretty convinced, certainly in my own case, I looked at, when I ate, food is highly palatable, highly energy dense, highly processed food. This stuff is psychoactive. It can change how I feel, right? And I would use food to calm myself. I would use food, if it's 10 o'clock at night, to, if I had 4 hours more of work to get through and I needed to improve my cognitive focus and combat fatigue, I would use food to change how I felt, right? And I think we all have these blips throughout the day where, in affect, how I feel that, some of us, self-medicate more than others. For some of us, it's foods. For some, it was tobacco. Other things can capture them. I doubt there's anyone a member of the species who doesn't get captured by something for whom the reward circuits, but I think it varies.
I agree. I love that you mentioned that 10 p.m. because you say that you were your most vulnerable. It was a pressing unease that would push you towards the kitchen in that moment when you would just feel that you needed that food.
If I needed it and just went down, I wouldn't have that pressing moment. It's only when you have that pressing, that moment of uncomfort, that moment of, just slight unease, right? That all of a sudden you have that slight unease, and then you go, should I get something to eat? Maybe not. It's not going to be good for me. And then it builds, right? And the reason, that happens at 10 o'clock at night is because it happened at 10 o'clock at night the night before or the week before. It's all based on past learning and past experience, and, it goes back decades. So, it was 10 o'clock, decades ago when I was, in med school, or studying. That's how I would self-medicate. And we're just using, we're using food. This highly palatable food, again, is very effective at affecting how we feel. It can, once these circuits are activated, I can, get into a zone. Everything else can dissipate for the moment. It's how we cope.
It's really interesting because you talk about the reward system. So dopamine is part of the reward system. Can you explain to people what dopamine is for people that don't know and how this plays a part in our food reward?
So dopamine is not the pleasure, molecule, as some confuse it. Dopamine has more to do with wanting and cue-induced wanting. So there's a gating of neural circuits, this increased focus attention that, drives me to focus on certain cues. What's a cue? A cue can be a time of day. It could be this mug. It could be a place setting. It could be a certain internal feeling. And that cue, right, triggers some sensory aspect. And dopamine really, is in some ways a learning molecule, a gating molecule. It can trigger a wanting, a seeking. Now, there are certain chemicals like cocaine and amphetamine that have very large rises in brain dopamine. Food doesn't, compare to those, but there's a cue, there's a feeling of unease. In the past, I've used food because of that unease. So I lock in that dopamine. It helps me lock in that attentional gating, right? So of all the things in my environment, all of a sudden, it's 10 o'clock, I'm going to start thinking about food.
So it's that brain memory that's going on. Is
it a brain memory? It's also, is it an emotional memory? It's both, right? But these are part of the emotional core of our brain. It's what we get captured by. It can get hijacked to different degrees, right? It can get, we tend to think of addiction as something that is for the weak, for the downtrodden. But in fact, we all have these circuits at play. And I think it's why it's so hard. It's so hard to resist. I know it's not good for anybody, but yet I do it. And once I start, I have a hard time stopping.
I think everyone listening to this will connect to that line.
The question is, can we crack this thing called food addiction? However, we end up, the biology is not fully worked out of all the neural circuits, but that wanting, that cue-induced wanting, that craving, and that craving only comes on when I try to resist, right? You don't know these circuits are at play until you say, you go without. And then why is there this pull of food, right? And then why do you regain, or why do you relapse? Because if I haven't retrained the circuits, if the circuits are there, I've done without, I've deprived myself, I go back into this environment. I mean, I can hold that life preserver down for a certain period of time, but I can't do it indefinitely. So the question is, people go, well, what can calm those circuits? I mean, I don't want to have this wanting, this. I don't want to keep on eating. And the consequences of that, right? Again, it's not weight, but the metabolic consequences of this eating this highly, overeating this highly processed, energy dense food is just so dramatic because you can't get rid of the circuits. The circuits are there, right? But how do you tame the circuits?
Well, it's interesting because I think it's around 40. I'm going to have to see if these stats, you're going to have to test me. 41.9% of Americans are now obese. And you say in the book, by 2030, that'll be 50%. Looking at where we are currently in the modern food environment, I agree. I feel a lot of people really struggle because choice is something that I also talk about. Whereas, do we really have choice? Because what's on offer to us is actually not healthy options most of the time. And I think when we think about weight, it comes also with a lot of shame and a lot of stigma attached to it too. And you speak from a really interesting angle, I think, because you're a fellow sufferer, as you just said, and I want to talk more about your journey. You're the former commissioner of the FDA, the dean at Yale Medical School, and the chief science officer during the US COVID response. So you don't just speak as a policymaker and somebody who has kind of understood the area of policy and public health so well, but also someone who has gone through a life of this that many people will be able to relate to. You have used GLP-1.
So I had the privilege of co-leading Operation Warp Speed, 2 years of just intense work, 7 days a week, 18-hour, found myself 40 pounds. You can translate into stones, heavier. And I got to the point where I didn't like myself. And I said, all right, let me lose weight. And I had done this repeatedly over a lifetime. So I went on a moderately low-carb diet. It had always worked in the past. And it wasn't going as quickly this time. Lost about 6 pounds. Ended up having a kidney stone, and just finding myself in an emergency room. They drew some bloods, and then they said, well, your calcium is high. So, why do I have high calcium? So I ended up in an endocrinologist's office. The high calcium was just a spurious result. It was a lab error. But the endocrinologist, I took a history. I said, I'm losing weight. I lost 6 pounds. He says, well, I'm doing clinical trials with the GLP-1 drugs. You qualify. Do you want to start? And I was studying this. I had decided to write the book. So let's
Perfect
experience.
Case study.
Let's experience. Let's live it. If you're going to write the book, you have to live it. And I went on and injected myself there in the office.
How did you feel in that moment when you thought, I'm gonna try it?
I don't think anyone understands how these really work.
That's a really good point to
Right.
make.
These drugs work by slowing down the food emptying out of your stomach. So food stays in your stomach longer. Now, in order that happens, that there's an effect on the GI tract. There's also an effect on the brain, the hindbrain. The area of postrema for the neuroscientists listening, the NTS, the nucleus solitarius. I mean, that part of the brain, as opposed to the reward center, are the aversive circuits. So, there were circuits that evolved when you had certain toxins into the GI system. The GI tract would slow down. We've all experienced this. When food stays in your stomach longer, how do you feel?
Nauseous.
Right? These drugs work. The part of the hindbrain, that's the vomit center, of the brain. And these are the aversive circuits. Now, the way the great thing about these drugs is what the pharmaceutical companies figured out how to titrate the dose of these drugs, right? So there is this cascade, right, in this spectrum. There's a sense of fullness. And then there's Thanksgiving dinner fullness, right? I've eaten too much. And then I can push you to the edge of nausea. but then I could push you over that edge of nausea to real GI distress and,
Be sick.
and you can be sick. So what these drugs do is they push you to the edge of nausea. So the mechanism of action, in part, there are other mechanisms of action, but one of the significant mechanisms of action of these drugs, these drugs work through their adverse events, that nausea, right? That GI distress is in part the mechanism of action. It's how these drugs work. What's strong enough to overcome an addiction?
A drug.
What kind of drug? A drug that makes you
rewire your brain, I guess.
Right. If I can make you feel nauseous, if you have the flu, you want to eat?
No.
If you have food poisoning, you want to eat?
No, that's always a reference I think about. Yeah.
Right. And how long does that memory, right? You ever have food poisoning?
Yes.
You remember it?
I remember it very well.
Okay.
I haven't eaten that food since.
Right. Now you understand. That became highly salient to you. Still to this day, if you saw that food, right, you wouldn't want it. You would associate that memory. Now you understand a salient stimuli. What's strong enough? If the addictive circuits, want me to eat more and more and attract me to something's positive valence, what's strong enough to shut down those circuits? If I push you to the edge of nausea, I'm going to tamp down the addictive circuits. You have this counterbalancing those addictive circuits, those reward circuits, with these aversive circuits, right? So, you go, all right, well, it's, if you look at whether it's diet, drugs, or surgery, they all work by the same way. If the goal is to reduce visceral adiposity, right, the only way you can do that is if you eat less. That phrase, eat less, exercise more, no one could do it. It didn't work. It was the biggest failure because, there are addictive circuits that are counterbalancing why I can't eat less. Now I can tamp down those addictive circuits by pushing you to the edge of nausea. So I went on this drug, and the great thing about these drugs is they can condition you while you're on them to eat differently, right? Now, the pharmaceutical companies would like you to stay, the premise of these, to stay on these drugs lifelong. Not going to happen. Maybe for some people, right? But between the cost of injecting yourself or the fact that these drugs work, they're expensive, but they also work by the adverse events and that visceral malaise. Do I really want to experience that for my whole life? So the average amount of time in the U.S., the data show that people are on this drug are 8 to 9 months. Now, about 20% go off and go back on. So what's going to happen for that 8 to 9 months? People will lose weight. They go off the drugs. They only make you push to the edge of nausea while you're on the drug. What's going to happen when you go off this? You're going
to gain weight.
Why? Because those addictive circuits are still there. So the question is, while you're on these drugs, can you use that period of time to change your relationship with food? So you learn to, in essence, can you condition yourself? Can your body condition yourself to change your relationship with food? Now, can that carry over if you go off the drugs? I don't think there's enough data on how, and I think the companies need to collect this data on how we can use these drugs in the real world. Is it safe to go back on, to go back off? You just turned to the page to my favorite diagram in the whole book.
Thank you. It's one of my favorites. It's why I've got a great analogy of the full hunger signal.
I'm so excited. You have all these stickies, right? The privilege of somebody when you started off by saying, I spent 3 days reading this, right? Just thank you. Because, there's been thousands of books written on diet. Fair?
Yeah, absolutely. This is my space.
Right?
This is what I'm in.
Right.
Yeah.
And still,
we're still in a confused system, and everybody, I think, feels very lost and overwhelmed where we are.
And the goal was, could we just be evidence-based and clear and try to understand what is it? Why do I struggle? How do I crack food addiction? And because there's no one answer. Everybody enters this at a different place. The drugs are one tool, please. They are not a panacea. There's no magic to these, but the real thing to do is how do you change your relationship with food?
I think that's a big thing, right? Because I think when we talk about those 8 to 9 months when someone might be on this drug, it's essentially kind of pausing that problem. It's kind of putting it on ice and giving yourself the space. I think that the situation that we're in is that there's not any advice nutritionally, dietetically, any type of nutritional therapy around these prescriptions of drugs to help people on that journey as much.
Hooray, somebody has said that, right? This is one big, Wild West. I mean, we let these drugs out and they are very powerful. They are potentially very dangerous. I mean, my best estimate, is the companies have not really said how much people are eating when they're on these drugs.
Which worries me about nutritional deficiency and dehydration and all of these problems. Yeah.
I mean, let alone the malnutrition. I mean, people are eating, many people are eating probably less than 1,000 calories.
Which is kind of semi-starvation. That's
exactly correct. I said this at a medical meeting, but I asked the question, isn't this just forced anorexia? I think we have to be very sensitive to whether they can trigger eating disorders. I think the reality is, I think there's much more dysfunctional eating than we care to admit. I think we are.
I think we all are on a scope of an eating disorder spectrum.
Thank you for saying that. No one admits that. I think the eating disorder specialists, I have a great deal of respect for them. They won't even think about the term food addiction. It scares them because you mentioned food addiction. Of course, there's addictive circuits in play in the eating disorders. I mean, they're at play. They're concerned that once you mention eating disorders, that triggers abstinence, and abstinence only compounds the cycle. So I think we have to be very, very careful. The other thing you said in your introduction, how difficult a subject this is to talk about, right? And the shame, the stigma, and for decades, nothing worked. Right. And we got to the point, nothing worked. And people said, if nothing works, and I think there's a lot of good that came out of this, just love your body. And so you go, all right, that's great. But as a doc, I see this, this increase in this visceral adiposity, this inflammatory state, this cardiac disease, kidney disease. And can't we get to the point where you can love your body, but also take care of your health? And that's a hard line to walk, right?
It's a very hard line to walk. And I think it's one that I speak a lot about. I think the shame is such a hard topic to approach. I think the spectrum of an eating disorder is so vast and so large. And I think so many of us think about it as anorexia nervosa or bulimia or binge eating, but it's not. We have an emotional connection to food. That's part of us inherently. It's culturally part of human beings, right? Exactly. And I think the interesting space that I see with this area of the drugs is some people really do struggle to lose weight. And this can be an amazing step forward if done properly, if given the right support and the right help on this journey to allow people to feel that there's hope. If you don't have hope, then the quality of life is diminished. The worry I have, which I'd love to ask you about, is the microdosing side of Ozempic, where a lot of people now are trying to kind of teeter with the dosages on doing small microdosing to get those last few pounds off that maybe don't have that relationship with obesity at all, that are nowhere near that obesity angle. And now it's becoming so easily available to buy. It's now becoming a bit of a trend in that area. And I think it's important to talk about that bit. And I think the understanding of just how powerful these drugs are might not be translated in that message.
Number one, I'm not going to judge.
No, there's no judgment. I think it's just allowing...
But these drugs are approved for certain indications.
Yes.
Okay. And we're talking about, right? And so there were certain indications. FDA in the States originally they realized BMI is a lousy measure. I mean, there are better measures of visceral adiposity. But these drugs were tested in people, who had, a BMI of 27 and a comorbidity and some metabolic consequences, but to treat visceral adiposity and to treat health.
Yeah.
Right. And the people who are taking this are not the goal is not to improve health. It's cosmetic. But is it also improving their health?
Well, I think the malnourishment is not improving health if it's not people aren't maintaining a healthy.
Let's be clear. What I care about is the focus on health. If this is going to improve visceral adiposity, if this is going to improve your metabolic parameters, and where prevention, ends and treatment starts, because if these diseases are a lifelong, if cardiac disease is a continuum of buildup, of atherosclerotic plaque, et cetera, and inflammation over a lifetime, and it's that cumulative burden, what's prevention, what's treatment. But if these drugs are used to significantly to improve your metabolic health, to improve the risk of cardiac disease, of kidney disease, of diabetes, and you're reducing visceral adiposity, that's what these drugs are for. I think most obesity medicine docs would say, I'm not even using these drugs for a 20-pound weight loss. I think that is probably too strict, because the real question is, are there metabolic parameters at play, right? And if there's metabolic parameters at play that you can improve your health, right, I'm all for it. The real question you have to ask yourself, are the risks acceptable in light of the benefits? So if I have metabolic, dysfunction, if I have potentially cardiac disease down the road, if I'm pre-diabetic, of course, those are very significant benefits, so I can justify the risk. But there are real risks with these drugs. There's malnourishment, we talked about, eating disorders, there's a whole slew of GI conditions, there's pancreatitis, there is fatigue, there's some contraindications. Thyroid cancers, other familial cancers. The companies will argue, well, these drugs have been, we have 15 years of experience. But the reality is, these drugs did come on a decade and a half ago, but we're using them at doses that are higher than we've used them 15 years ago. I can tell you there's always going to be, when you're using these powerful drugs, there's going to be side effects, and it's the unknowns that concern me. We're starting to see certain eye conditions. Now, is it associated with the drug? Is it associated with people with diabetes have this? Is it the drop in glucose? Is it the diabetes? Is it a drug? Those things are being sorted out. But the real question you have to ask yourself is not, do I take this, for a small amount of weight? Because it's not weight that I care about, but are the risks acceptable in the light of the benefits?
Well, I think that's just something that is important, that I guess these drugs can become so readily available now on the internet that the risk versus benefits isn't always obvious for some people.
Please don't use these drugs outside of the care of a physician, or at least, people who are skilled. I think if you're going to take someone down below 1,000 calories, it takes a team approach. This is not something you want to wing.
100%. But I think it's important. I think there's two different areas that we're talking about here. And I think, going alongside the chronic disease, the metabolic disorders, I've turned to the page continuing the journey, because I want to get people to understand how they can support themselves if they go on these drugs, or if they decide not to, what direction could they be thinking about getting themselves back on that. But it is interesting how currently we're in this interesting paradigm where it's not just people that struggle with obesity that are using these drugs.
I'm under no illusion, but understand there's no end game. So if you go on this, understand there's no end game, because you're going to go off, you're going to get it back. And I hit my target weight considerable time ago, and everything, that's when the hard part starts. It's about maintaining the weight. But you need a set of tools, because there's no one tool that's going to work for a lifetime. First of all, nothing works for a lifetime. You shouldn't do this without understanding the behavioral, the emotional component. Physical activity obviously is a mainstay, and probably more important. Once you get the weight off, that visceral adiposity, it's easier to move to engage in physical activity.
Because it's less challenging. It's probably more desirable. People probably feel better once they've lose their weight to put on their gym clothes.
But again, you need to have a strategy, right? And when you're dealing with the addictive circuits, there is nothing wrong with saying, I can't do this alone. I need help.
100%. I think that should be people's motto in life for anything. Asking for help, because we know community and support does so well, especially when it comes to weight loss. And I think continuing the journey, which is kind of a big part of the book, which I found really interesting, goes very much into one of the biggest weight loss trials, DIRECT, which was Diabetes Remission Clinical Trial. And it looked at 3 different diets: low fat, Mediterranean, low carb. And I think this is the conversation.
Because the book's not just about the drugs.
No, it's not just about the drugs.
I mean,
it's about the entire journey.
And I mean, that was the goal, because everybody's going to come at this and have to do it for themselves, and they're going to have to put it together for yourself. Now you get help, but there's no cookie cutter approach that's going to work for everybody.
I want to talk about when people are on this journey, or maybe they're not even on the GLP-1 drug, but when they're looking at changing their connection to food. So when I looked at these 3 different food groups, or these 3 different diets that we would look at, when you were on your journey, if I put these 3 in front of you, how would you have navigated this? Because I can look at the literature and I think we could all have knowledge and understanding, but you were in the situation, you were taking that drug. How do you then decide and actually start activating this change in behavior if you were to pick one of these diets to start changing?
So you have to realize there are addictive circuits in the brain, and then, what do I want? What do I need? How does it make me feel? But you're trained. You're a nutritional biochemist, right? And I think these debates in nutrition, I mean, and certainly in the States, I don't think have served the public well. We have dietary guidelines in the States that are written for, in essence, a healthy body. And the fact very few people are metabolically healthy, I mean, in the States. And so when you look, and this is a thing that concerns me, over the last 20 years, the level of hyperinsulinemia has more than doubled. We have an epidemic of hyperinsulinemia. And most people don't measure insulin levels. The assays are not great. I mean, there's variability. But, an insulin-dominant, hormonal situation is not great for any organ, and certainly not great for certain cancers. I mean, those growth factors. And we have an epidemic of hyperinsulinemia. Now, science hasn't figured out whether that hyperinsulinemia is a result of the visceral fat, or which comes first, hyperinsulinemia or the visceral fat, right? Because, I mean, if there's visceral fat, is the hyperinsulinemia just a compensatory biochemical reaction, or is the hyperinsulinemia actually causing increased fat storage, increased fat liver? And I think that there is certainly considerable evidence that if you have a fatty liver, you want to get those insulin levels down. For me, recognizing the vast majority of people who struggle with their weight, who are obese or overweight, are insulin resistant to some extent. I mean, in anybody who's insulin resistant, adding, just massive amounts of flooding the system, of absorbing rapid increases in blood glucose from these rapidly absorbable carbohydrates is only adding fuel to the fire. So I think no doubt there's excess calories, but I think that when it comes to visceral fat, being able to reduce the absorption of these rapidly absorbable carbohydrates is important. Now, the Mediterranean diet gets you there. A low-carb diet can get you there. A moderately low-carb diet can get you there. But I think that processing has a lot of detrimental effects. Primarily, it's the fat, sugar, and salt. But these rapidly absorbable carbohydrates are adding fuel to the fire of a metabolically unhealthy body. The carbohydrates that have these very rapid release that are going to up the blood glucose. I mean, and in essence, also then up the insulin levels of the body. So vegetables, fruits, the release of those carbohydrates is relatively controlled because there's structure, right? It's just this massive flood that I think in a hyperinsulinemic state only adds fuel to the fire.
So I think that people can connect to the Mediterranean diet because it's got a lot of fibrous foods in. I'm very strong on the gut microbiome, but I'm also very strong on protein at the same time. Protein helps us keep us fuller for longer. I think when people are trying to go on this journey from going from these highly addictive foods, ultra-processed food environments, 2/3 of our shopping baskets are full of them now. I think trying to make it as easy as possible for people to understand this navigation is really important on this journey. So getting people to know what fibrous foods are, what type of fibrous foods are there, what types of foods are good quality protein foods, getting people to understand those basics, I think are essential on this journey, which I think has become very displaced in our modern food environment from the marketing and the terminology and people being scared that some really good healthy foods aren't good for them.
So I agree 100%. My only concern, the Mediterranean diet has a lot of grains in it. And I think depending on your metabolic state, whether you could look, some people can handle that grain without having huge spikes in their glucose. Others people cannot. But it concerns me. I mean, again, until you can take the body out of this insulin-resistant state, just adding more of this in essence, glucose and fructose. I mean, to me, that stuff is just being converted into liver fat and increases visceral adiposity. So I think again, it's going to depend on the individual, right?
I also think it depends on their quality of their full diet. Because I would be less concerned with someone having grains than someone having sugary cereal every morning. I think kind of the first step that I really see in this is getting people just to eat whole food first. Because I don't think people are eating enough whole foods. I think if we're actually looking at kind of what people are eating, when we start then like kind of putting it down and down, people then, I feel people get overwhelmed. I think if we can really start really tweaking those parts of the diet, that's an amazing step.
We are in full agreement. The only thing is there are people who are not going to want to go on drugs, right? And you don't have to go on drugs in order to control visceral adiposity. And for some people, I think that the restricting the rapidly absorbable carbohydrates can be an effective tool to reduce visceral adiposity. And again, if you can do it just by reducing calories, that's great. But others, I mean, I think do better. If you look at those graphs, I mean, in the book, I mean, I think that you certainly want to give people certain nutritional options. So, again, you're going to need those nutritional options. If you're going to, be on these drugs, then you're going to go off these drugs. What are you going to do when you go off these drugs? So you have to learn the nutrition. Going to Whole Foods is great. Other people, I think, are more sensitive to some of these, again, as I call them, rapidly absorbable carbohydrates, and they do better without it. It stimulates less hunger, it produces less liver fat. Again, we haven't done a great job in the field of nutrition in helping people understand, what the tools are. I think that it's very important if you go on this journey that you, and it's one of the reasons I wrote the book, just give some more of an education in what you can use in order to achieve a healthy weight. And it's not just drugs. There is not going to be one tool that either prevents or treats this over a lifetime.
I mean, it takes you to a really interesting question of where we are currently, or where America is currently in your health system. I made a stat at the beginning that was in your book that by 2030, half of Americans will be obese. That's what was written as 41.9% currently. What is going on right now? I mean, JF Kennedy, I'd love to speak to you about, but what do you think the trajectory is going to look like with the implementations that they'll be putting in at the moment? And do you agree with them? What are your views on the
Well,
policy
I mean,
right now?
you now have you have 4% of Americans, the data I saw yesterday, on GLP-1 drugs. It's a lot of people on these drugs. Half for diabetes.
I thought it was 2%, so it's 4% now.
With 2% for diabetes and 2% for weight loss, right? I mean, it's new data. I mean, it used to be 2%. I mean, it is up. People are going to sooner rather than later say, hey, this may work, but again, there's something wrong with this picture. Why am I taking a drug to control my visceral adiposity and make me healthy when it's the food that's making me sick? Why don't I just deal with the food? So, I mean, it's an awakening, right? It's also an awakening that it's not willpower. We've been dealing with an obesogenic food environment for 4 decades. I mean, we saw the great change, the great public health success. We were able to play a small role. I mean, in tobacco, look, in the end, do I think it's going to be laws and regulations and in taxes and reductions in advertising? Those are all important tools to change how we perceive. But once you realize these ultra-formulated foods are addictive, right? And those circuits are there. The problem is not food. The problem is this ultra-formulated food, this energy-dense, highly palatable, highly processed, high glycemic index foods. I mean, that's the problem. And we're going to have to change the valence. We're going to have to change how people perceive it. And I think if people are taking these drugs, they're going to go, hey, it's great. I mean, I can reclaim my health. But along the way, that you're going to have to realize that, hey, it's the food. And I think RFK Jr. certainly has tapped into a populist chord. I mean, he's right. I mean, that food is center. He's right about chronic disease. Do they know how to fix it? I don't think they have a clue, right? And certainly the anti-science, the anti-biomedical research, the anti-vaccine, I mean, none of that is helpful, right? I mean, and it's not going to advance it. Look, the problem is the visceral adiposity. We know what's causing it. It's these ultra-formulated foods. We have to give people the tools to deal with their health today, and we have to change the environment, I mean, over time.
What would you want to see put in practice?
I want to make sure people get good care. I want to make sure people have access to these drugs. I want to make sure that people use these drugs smartly and wisely and can use these drugs and recognize it's not for everybody, to understand the risks and benefits, to have a range of tools to take care of their health, but have the ability to reclaim their health. I mean, I think that's within our grasp. I think we've been relatively passive. Nothing's worked in the past. I think we now understand what's causing this. I think we have tools, not perfect tools, but that can change this. I think we can give back people their health, and I think we need to, fight for a safer environment for all of us. But I really would like people to have the information and the access and the ability to lead healthier lives that are not plagued by these chronic diseases. We've not been able to do it in the past without drugs. Now, we understand more. Again, I don't think drugs are I think they're one tool. I think we should be able to talk about visceral adiposity and love your body and say you can also, care about your health and do that without stigma or shame and have that conversation. And I applaud you. I think there should be no stigma about using these drugs. But using these drugs to improve your metabolic profile, to deal with visceral fat, and just because, I was born and I didn't have the genes that, turn on the satiety hormones to shut down appetite, there's no reason why we shouldn't be able to have some, biological fix for that, because that's what's at play.
And can I ask how long you were on the drugs for?
I was on the drugs for about 6-7 months. I went off for a period of time. I went back on for a period of time. Again, I think this is about how you change your relationship with food, what you want, what your eating patterns are. I mean, it is a journey. I'm able to maintain my weight today, tomorrow, not sure.
Yeah, so how is your relationship with food now?
I have more tools to help me deal with it. And there's comfort in that. But I have access to those tools. I have, I have that knowledge. I can use those tools, I think, in a safe, thoughtful manner. And that's why I wrote the book. I wanted people to have access to those tools and that information, because those addictive circuits are always there. They can always show their heads. I'm still going to go reach, for, something to calm me or soothe me at that moment.
And with those tools, for people who are saying, he keeps mentioning these tools, and I know nutrition is one of them. Can you mention the other ones that have helped you?
Well, I think that there are nutritional tools. There are different diets. You laid out 3 diets, but there is behavioral techniques, right? There's physical activity. That as you shed that visceral adiposity, you and I talk, become much more possible to do. You can substitute. You could go. Physical activity can become salient, and it has its own addictive potential because it can change how you feel, right? Because we're dealing with the emotional core of the brain.
I think to embody up how I would see those tools is, once people feel that they have control, as you said, on the eating side, if they do go on the GLP-1, or whether they don't, it's such a lifestyle approach for me of when I see patients that aren't on drugs anyway, such as how they speak to themselves. I'm very big into compassion and understanding that narrative that you say in your mind, because that drives the stress response. I think we live in such a chronically stressed environment that trying to understand where your stress is coming from and how much that is impacting you. I sometimes think that we're not always conscious of just how much stress one is carrying, because we're just meant to kind of deal with it. So having more conscious awareness of that, I think sleep is a huge thing.
Absolutely.
Getting people onto that, getting people to change parts of their environment that they're really struggling with, whether it's their sleep environment, whether it's the food that's out around them, whether it's having a water bottle next to them all the time, even something so simple as hydration. Unless we see a cue to drink water, we don't. Simply just allowing yourself to constantly have a water bottle in front of you can help. So there's all of these different modalities that is so important to talk about.
And there's your brain and the physiology there's the ups and downs of throughout the day, right?
And knowing that's human.
And we use things to change how we feel. Food is one of those, and it's never going to go away. The question is, can you manage it, right? And the good thing is, I think we understand what the culprit is, right? We understand in a way that we never understood before. What's at the heart of much of this, cardiac, kidney, metabolic disease, right? And there's just enormous opportunity, as you say, to live well and be well.
Well, that's my closing question, David, to you, which is, what does live well, be well mean to you?
When you're talking about food, you're talking about weight, you're talking about going on drugs, you're talking about, how you feel, throughout these ups and downs. These are highly personal subjects. The goal is to connect and to have these kinds of discussions. I think that men and women approach these things differently, right? I look at men with, now significant visceral adiposity, that beer belly, and what was viewed in the past maybe as something that society accepted. It's killing people, right? And yet we haven't fully, I think men sometimes have a harder time talking about it. So being able to connect, to share, I think that's what live well, be well. I think if you can have some of these hard conversations and we take some of the mystery out of what's happening, with ourselves, so we can like ourselves a little more, and because when there are forces that are playing, you don't understand them, and you're doing things that you don't want to be doing, but you're doing them anyway. That's never a great recipe. So if you can understand them and you can control them, and you can thrive, and you can be healthier, right, and live a longer, more productive, less disabled life. I think that's live well and be well.
Yeah, it's the quality of life. And I love that you said if you can like yourself, because I think essentially that is, I believe, like such a foundational point of health that we massively overlook and we don't talk about. And we live in a world of comparison more than ever before, and intense shame. So having that as a compass is very important. So David, thank you.
Thank you
for coming on. And as you can see, if you're on YouTube, I have made so many sticky notes in this book from you, David. I really enjoyed reading it. And I know a lot today has been on GLP-1, but it's not all about this in this book. There are so many different methods, scientific, ethical studies in here to show different ways and different routes into this journey of navigating, as you said, a very obesogenic environment, which can feel like a loss of hope for some people. So I definitely recommend it. And thank you for writing it and all the work. And maybe this will be your time to relax now. But if it's not, then I'd love to have you back on again and speak about your next journey.
I appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Thank you, David.